The sun was setting over Pine Grove, casting long shadows across the clean suburban streets as Ashley Thompson headed home from her volunteer shift at the Helping Paws Animal Shelter. Her dark curls were pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she still had cat fur on her favorite blue volunteer t-shirt, evidence of the 3 hours she'd spent socializing with rescue kittens. The 17-year-old honor student hummed along to her favorite song, thinking about the tiny orange tabby that had finally started eating on its own. The warm spring evening felt perfect, the kind that made you believe anything was possible. Ashley had just received her early acceptance letter to Georgetown University that morning, and she couldn't wait to tell her dad the news over dinner. He'd been pulling extra hours at work lately, but he always made time for their Friday night family meals. At exactly 6:47 p.m., Ashley stopped at the red light on Maple Drive, just 3 blocks from home. She double-checked her mirrors, a habit her father had drilled into her since she started driving. That's when she noticed the police cruiser pulling up behind her. She didn't think much of it at first. Officer Reynolds, their neighborhood patrol officer, often waved to her on her way home from volunteering. But this wasn't Officer Reynolds' car. The cruiser's lights suddenly flashed to life, painting the interior of Ashley's small Honda in alternating blue and red. Her heart skipped a beat, but she remained calm. After all, she knew exactly what to do. Her father had walked her through traffic stops countless times, making sure she understood her rights and proper procedures. Following protocol perfectly, Ashley turned on her hazard lights, signaled, and pulled over to the right side of the empty street. She positioned her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, clearly visible through the rear window. The sun had dipped lower now, and the street lights were just starting to flicker on, casting an artificial glow over the scene. Through her side mirror, Ashley watched as a tall officer emerged from the cruiser. His walk was different from Officer Reynolds' friendly stride. This one moved with rigid steps, his hand already resting on his holster despite the peaceful suburban setting. The nameplate on his uniform read Officer Barrett, and something about his demeanor made Ashley's skin prickle with unease. She took a deep breath, remembering her father's words, "Stay calm, be respectful, but know your rights." The sound of heavy boots approaching her car window seemed unusually loud in the quiet neighborhood. Ashley could see Mrs. Chen watering her prized roses across the street, pausing to watch the scene unfold. The knot in Ashley's stomach tightened as Officer Barrett's shadow fell across her window. She hadn't done anything wrong, she was sure of it. The light had been red, and she had stopped completely, just like always. Yet something told her this wasn't going to be a routine traffic stop. As she waited for the tap on her window, Ashley's fingers instinctively brushed against her phone in the cup holder. Her dad had set up an emergency contact feature that would send him her location with just 3 quick taps. She hadn't ever needed to use it before, but right now, knowing it was there made her feel a little safer. The sharp rap on her window made her jump slightly, even though she'd been expecting it. As she reached to lower her window, Ashley noticed her hand was trembling just a bit. The evening air carried the scent of Mrs. Chen's roses mixed with the metallic tang of approaching rain. What should have been just another peaceful drive home was about to become something very different. Officer Barrett's flashlight beam cut through the evening shadows, sweeping across Ashley's face and then around the interior of her car. She squinted against the harsh light, but kept her hands steady on the steering wheel, just as she'd been taught. The beam lingered on her volunteer shirt, then moved to the animal shelter pamphlets scattered on the passenger seat. "License and registration," Barrett demanded, his voice sharp and cold. There was none of the usual professional courtesy Ashley had come to expect from their local police officers. No good evening or explanation for the stop, just that clipped command that seemed to carry an unspoken threat. "Yes, sir," Ashley replied politely, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "My registration is in the glove compartment and my license is in my wallet. I'm going to reach for them now, if that's okay." She narrated her movements clearly, just as her father had taught her. The officer gave a curt nod, his hand still resting on his holster. As Ashley carefully reached for her documents, she noticed Mrs. Chen had stopped watering her roses completely. The elderly woman stood frozen, garden hose dripping quietly onto her flower beds, her eyes fixed on the scene unfolding in front of her house. Other neighbors were starting to notice too. Mr. Peterson had paused while walking his golden retriever, and the Williams kids had stopped their basketball game to watch. "You ran that red light back there," Officer Barrett stated flatly as he snatched the documents from Ashley's trembling fingers. It wasn't a question, but a declaration of guilt that made Ashley's stomach drop. "Sir, I'm certain I stopped completely at the red light," she responded respectfully but firmly. "I always do, especially at that intersection." She could feel her heart pounding against her ribs, but she kept her voice calm and clear. The officer's face hardened at her response. "Are you saying I'm lying?" he demanded, leaning down closer to her window. His badge caught the gleam of the streetlight, and Ashley caught a whiff of coffee on his breath. "Because I can add disrespecting an officer to your charges." Ashley felt her throat tighten. This wasn't right. None of it was right. She'd seen enough of her father's work to know when someone was abusing their authority, but she also knew how dangerous it could be to challenge that abuse directly. "No, sir," she replied carefully, measuring each word. "I'm not saying that at all. I'm just trying to understand why I was pulled over. Could you please explain what you observed?" It was a reasonable request, one that any good officer should be willing to answer. But Officer Barrett's expression darkened further. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, taking a step back and placing his hand more firmly on his holster. The street had grown eerily quiet. Even the evening birds seemed to have fallen silent. "Sir," Ashley's voice wavered slightly now, "I don't understand why that's necessary. I haven't done anything wrong." She could see Mrs. Chen pulling out her phone, likely recording the interaction. The elderly woman had been like a grandmother to Ashley since they'd moved to the neighborhood 10 years ago. "I said, step out of the vehicle." Barrett's voice rose sharply, echoing off the neat suburban houses. "Do not make me tell you again." His other hand moved to the handcuffs on his belt, the metal gleaming ominously in the fading light. Ashley's fingers brushed against her phone again. 3 quick taps, that's all it would take to alert her father. But Barrett was watching her every move now, his stance aggressive and intimidating. She had to be careful, had to think this through. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. As she reached for her seatbelt, she managed to slide her phone partially out of the cup holder. 1 tap. She'd need to get the other 2 in somehow. The evening air felt thick with tension as Ashley prepared to open her car door. More neighbors had emerged from their homes, drawn by the escalating situation. The Williams kids' basketball rolled forgotten down their driveway, and Mr. Peterson had pulled out his phone too, joining Mrs. Chen in documenting what was quickly becoming a disturbing abuse of power. 2 more taps. The emergency signal was sent. 3 blocks away, in his home office, FBI Supervisory Special Agent David Thompson's phone buzzed with an alert that would change everything. But for now, Ashley stood alone, facing an officer who seemed determined to turn a routine traffic stop into something far more serious. The sun had almost completely set now, and storm clouds were gathering overhead, as if nature itself was responding to the growing tension on Pine Grove Street. The car door opened with a soft click that seemed too quiet for such a tense moment. Ashley stepped out slowly, her movements deliberate and careful, just as her father had taught her. The evening air felt cool against her skin, and she could smell rain approaching. Her volunteer shirt from the animal shelter suddenly felt too thin against the growing chill. "Hands where I can see them," Officer Barrett barked, though Ashley's hands were already raised to shoulder height. The growing crowd of neighbors watched in stunned silence as the scene unfolded under the harsh glow of streetlights. Mrs. Chen's garden hose continued to run, forgotten, creating a small stream that trickled down the sidewalk. "Sir," Ashley began, her voice trembling slightly but determined, "I'd like to call my father. He's a federal." "Quiet." Barrett cut her off, taking an aggressive step forward. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." His voice carried a note of satisfaction that made Ashley's stomach turn. She could hear someone in the crowd murmuring about calling 911, while another neighbor mentioned contacting the police department directly. The first drops of rain began to fall as Ashley complied, turning to face her car. Her mind raced through everything she knew about her rights, everything her father had taught her about handling difficult situations with law enforcement. But theory felt very different from reality when cold metal handcuffs were being snapped around your wrists. "Officer, please," Ashley tried once more, working to keep her voice steady. "This is a mistake. I can prove that I stopped at that light. There are traffic cameras." I said, "Be quiet." Barrett's grip tightened unnecessarily on her arm. "You're under arrest for running a red light, resisting arrest, and disrespecting an officer." Each charge was more ridiculous than the last, but Ashley knew better than to argue further. The handcuffs bit into her wrists as Barrett tightened them another notch. Mr. Peterson's golden retriever began barking agitatedly, picking up on the tension in the air. The Williams kids had run inside to get their parents, and more neighbors were emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Ashley could hear phones chiming as text messages spread through the neighborhood group chat, alerting others to the situation unfolding on their quiet street. "Officer Barrett," Mrs. Chen's wavering voice cut through the tension. "This is wrong, and you know it. She's just a child coming home from volunteering." The elderly woman had stepped closer, her phone still recording steadily despite her shaking hands. "Ma'am, step back, or you'll be arrested for interfering with police business," Barrett threatened, but Mrs. Chen stood her ground, her usual gentle demeanor replaced with quiet determination. Other neighbors moved closer too, phones raised, creating a circle of witnesses. The rain was falling steadily now, soaking through Ashley's shirt and making her shiver. She could feel her phone pressing against her leg in her pocket. The emergency signal had been sent, but how long would it take for help to arrive? Thunder rumbled in the distance, as if nature itself was protesting the injustice unfolding on Pine Grove Street. Barrett began moving Ashley toward his patrol car, his grip unnecessarily rough. She could see her reflection in the car's dark window, her neat ponytail now disheveled, her volunteer shirt getting soaked in the rain. The situation felt surreal, like something from one of her father's case files rather than her own life. Everyone dispersed now. Barrett shouted at the growing crowd of neighbors, "This is a police matter." But nobody moved. Instead, more phones came out, more witnesses positioning themselves to document every moment of this abuse of power. The Williams parents had joined the group, their faces a mix of concern and outrage. As Barrett reached for the patrol car's back door, Ashley heard a familiar engine sound in the distance, the distinctive purr of her father's FBI vehicle. Relief flooded through her, but she kept her expression neutral. Barrett was too focused on trying to intimidate the crowd to notice the approaching sound. The rain continued to fall, creating a curtain of water that reflected the patrol car's flashing lights. Ashley stood straight, dignity intact despite the handcuffs and the rain soaking through her clothes. She knew help was coming, but more importantly, she knew that every witness with a phone was ensuring that this incident wouldn't be brushed aside or covered up. Thunder cracked again, closer this time, and in the distance, another set of flashing lights appeared. Barrett's grip on Ashley's arm tightened as he noticed them too, though he couldn't yet see what kind of vehicle was approaching. But Ashley knew. In less than a minute, Officer Barrett would learn exactly who he had chosen to harass on this rainy evening, and nothing about his career would ever be the same. FBI Supervisory Special Agent David Thompson was reviewing case files in his home office when his phone buzzed with the emergency alert. The moment he saw the GPS coordinates, his heart stopped. They showed his daughter's location just 3 blocks away. 20 years of FBI training kicked in as he grabbed his badge and keys, his mind already racing through possible scenarios. The drive that normally took 5 minutes felt like an eternity. Rain pelted against his windshield as he activated his vehicle's emergency lights, cutting through the gathering storm. As he turned onto Pine Grove Street, the scene that greeted him made his blood run cold. His daughter, handcuffed in the rain, surrounded by neighbors with phones raised, and a police officer whose body language screamed of power abuse. David pulled up precisely 20 feet from the patrol car, positioning his vehicle at a tactical angle. The FBI lights cut through the rain with authority, casting alternating patterns across the wet pavement. He could see Officer Barrett's posture stiffen as he recognized the distinctive government plates. Years of experience had taught David the power of a calm, measured approach. He stepped out of his vehicle unhurried, letting the rain soak through his suit. His badge was already displayed on his chest, and his FBI windbreaker left no doubt about his authority. The neighbors' phones swiveled to capture his arrival, but David's focus remained solely on his daughter and the officer who had wrongfully detained her. Officer Barrett, David called out, his voice carrying the weight of 2 decades of federal law enforcement experience. I'm Supervisory Special Agent Thompson with the FBI. You're currently detaining my daughter. He moved forward with measured steps, each movement calculated to project both authority and control. Barrett's face went through a rapid series of emotions: shock, recognition, and then something close to fear. His grip on Ashley's arm loosened slightly, but he didn't release her. "Sir, this is a local police matter," he attempted, but his voice had lost its earlier arrogance. "Actually," David replied, continuing his steady approach, "it became a federal matter the moment you violated my daughter's civil rights." He paused, letting the rain fill the silence. "I've already contacted your chief of police. Internal Affairs is on their way. But right now, you're going to remove those handcuffs." Mrs. Chen had moved closer to Ashley, her phone still recording every moment. The Williams parents stood nearby, creating a protective semicircle. Mr. Peterson's golden retriever had finally stopped barking, sensing the shift in power dynamics. "Agent Thompson," Barrett tried again. She ran a red light and resisted. "Officer Barrett," David cut him off, his voice quiet but carrying an edge that made the officer flinch. "I'm going to share some information with you. My daughter's car is equipped with a dash cam. The intersection you claimed she ran has traffic cameras. There are currently 14 witnesses recording this interaction, and most importantly, your own bodycam is documenting everything." Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating the scene in stark detail. David could see the moment Barrett realized the full magnitude of his mistake. The officer's hand moved to his handcuff key, his previous bravado evaporating in the rain. "Before you remove those cuffs," David continued, pulling out his phone, "I'm going to call your commanding officer. He's expecting my call. I want him to hear directly from you why you felt it necessary to handcuff a 17-year-old volunteer worker who was 3 blocks from her home." The neighbors had fallen completely silent, watching the scene unfold. Even the rain seemed to have quieted, as if nature itself wanted to hear Barrett's explanation. Ashley stood tall despite her soaked clothes, her dignity intact. David felt a surge of pride mixed with anger. Pride in his daughter's composure, and carefully controlled anger at the officer who had tried to abuse his authority. David's phone was already dialing the police chief's number, the speaker on so everyone could hear. Barrett's hands shook slightly as he finally began removing the handcuffs from Ashley's wrists. The metallic click of their release seemed to echo down the quiet street. In the distance, more sirens approached, Internal Affairs responding to David's earlier call. But this was just the beginning. As an FBI agent specializing in civil rights violations, David knew exactly what steps would follow. Officer Barrett's actions tonight wouldn't just be a mark on his record. They would become a catalyst for departmental change. The rain continued to fall, but now it felt cleansing rather than oppressive. Ashley rubbed her wrists where the handcuffs had been too tight, and David resisted the urge to rush to her. There would be time for comfort later. Right now, he needed to ensure that every protocol was followed, every report filed, and every witness statement recorded. Because tonight wasn't just about his daughter, it was about ensuring this never happened to anyone else's child on this street, in this city, or under this officer's watch again. Red and blue lights pierced through the rain as 2 more police vehicles pulled onto Pine Grove Street. The Internal Affairs officers stepped out, their badges gleaming under the streetlights. Police Chief Richardson emerged from the lead car, his face set in grim determination as he surveyed the scene before him. The neighborhood had become an impromptu town hall, with residents huddled under umbrellas, still recording everything on their phones. Mrs. Chen had brought out towels for Ashley, who stood close to her father now, had a volunteer shirt soaked but her spirit unbroken. The Williams family had opened their garage, offering shelter to some of the elderly neighbors who refused to leave until they saw justice served. "Agent Thompson," Chief Richardson called out as he approached, his voice carrying authority and concern. "I've reviewed Officer Barrett's bodycam footage in real time. What I've seen is deeply troubling." He turned to face Barrett, who had lost all traces of his earlier swagger. "Officer, hand over your badge and weapon. You're suspended, effective immediately." The rain seemed to pause for a moment as Barrett's hand moved to his belt. The same hands that had roughly handcuffed an innocent teenager now trembled as he surrendered his badge and gun to his superior. The neighborhood watched in collective satisfaction, their phones capturing every second of accountability in action. "Chief," David spoke, his FBI training evident in his measured tone, "I want to be clear about what happens next. This isn't going to be handled internally. My daughter's civil rights were violated, and there are 14 civilian witnesses, plus video evidence from multiple sources." He gestured to the crowd of neighbors, their phones still raised. "The FBI's Civil Rights Division will be investigating this incident fully." Thunder rolled overhead as Chief Richardson nodded gravely. "Agent Thompson, you have my full cooperation. Our department has been working to root out these issues, and Officer Barrett's actions tonight are exactly what we're trying to eliminate." He turned to address the gathered neighbors. "I want to thank all of you for documenting this incident. Your video evidence will be crucial." The internal affairs officers had already begun taking witness statements. Mr. Peterson described how Barrett's aggression had been visible from the start. Mrs. Chen's hands still shook as she transferred her video footage to the investigators, her voice strong as she detailed everything she'd seen. The Williams parents provided their security camera footage, which had captured the entire incident from their driveway. Ashley stood with quiet dignity as she gave her statement, her voice clear and steady as she recounted every detail. Her father watched proudly, knowing that his daughter's composure under pressure would make her testimony even more powerful. The rain had eased to a gentle drizzle, almost as if nature itself was leaning in to hear her words. "I want everyone to understand something." Chief Richardson addressed the crowd, his voice carrying the weight of his position. "What happened here tonight is not what we stand for. Officer Barrett's actions go against everything in our training and our department's values. This will be thoroughly investigated, and there will be consequences." Barrett stood silently by his patrol car, watching his career crumble in real time. The same neighbors he had tried to intimidate minutes ago now stood as witnesses to his downfall. The power dynamic had shifted completely, justice arriving in the form of an FBI agent who happened to be a protective father. David's phone buzzed with messages from his FBI colleagues. The Civil Rights Division was already mobilizing, recognizing the significance of this case. This wasn't just about one officer or one incident, it was about addressing systemic issues that had gone unchecked for too long. Mrs. Chen approached Ashley with a thermos of hot tea, her grandmotherly concern showing through. "You handled yourself so well, dear," she said softly, wrapping a dry towel around Ashley's shoulders. Other neighbors nodded in agreement, their presence a testament to community solidarity in the face of injustice. The Williams kids had retreated to their garage but still watched intently as internal affairs officers photographed Ashley's wrists where the handcuffs had left marks. These would become evidence, another piece in the case that would reshape their local police department. As the night deepened, the impromptu gathering showed no signs of dispersing. This wasn't just a spectacle to them, it was their community standing up for one of their own, watching justice unfold in real time. The story of what happened on Pine Grove Street wouldn't end here. It would become a catalyst for change, a reminder that accountability was possible, and that sometimes justice arrived in the form of a father who refused to let abuse of power go unchallenged. The next morning dawned bright and clear, but Pine Grove Street was anything but quiet. News vans lined the curb where police cars had stood the night before. The story of what happened had spread like wildfire through social media, with the neighbors' videos gaining thousands of views overnight. The small suburban street had become the center of a conversation about police accountability that was rapidly spreading beyond their city limits. Inside the Thompson home, Ashley sat at the kitchen table with her father, both cups of coffee untouched in front of them. Her wrists still showed faint marks from the handcuffs, but it was the emotional impact that weighed heaviest. The early acceptance letter to Georgetown that had brought such joy yesterday morning felt like it had happened in another lifetime. "The department's internal investigation is already underway," David explained, his FBI badge resting on the table between them. "But more importantly, our Civil Rights Division has taken up the case. What happened to you isn't just going to be a mark on Barrett's record, it's going to be a catalyst for real change." The doorbell rang, and Mrs. Chen appeared with a homemade breakfast casserole, her way of showing support. She wasn't alone. Throughout the morning, neighbors kept dropping by, each bringing food, comfort, and their own recorded evidence from the previous night. The Williams family's security camera footage had proven especially valuable, showing clearly that Ashley had made a complete stop at the red light. By mid-morning, the police chief himself arrived at their door. He looked like he hadn't slept, his uniform crisp but his eyes tired. "We've completed our preliminary review of Officer Barrett's bodycam footage," he announced in their living room, now crowded with concerned neighbors. "What we found was troubling. This wasn't an isolated incident." David leaned forward, his FBI training evident in his focused attention. "Go on, Chief," he encouraged, though his hand instinctively moved closer to Ashley's. "We've discovered a pattern," the chief continued, his voice heavy with responsibility. "Barrett's bodycam footage from the past 6 months shows multiple incidents of questionable stops and escalated situations. They were buried in the system, never properly flagged for review. That changes today." The chief's phone buzzed constantly as he spoke. The department was in crisis mode. Barrett's actions had opened a Pandora's box of oversight issues that could no longer be ignored. Internal Affairs had been working through the night, pulling files, reviewing footage, and interviewing other officers. "We're implementing immediate changes," the chief announced. "Every officer's bodycam footage will be reviewed weekly. We're establishing a civilian oversight committee, and all traffic stop data will be publicly accessible. Your daughter's experience, as horrible as it was, might have just helped us prevent countless similar incidents." Outside, more news vans were arriving. The story had gone national. Ashley's phone kept lighting up with messages of support from friends and strangers alike who had seen the videos. The quiet volunteer who loved helping at the animal shelter had become an unexpected symbol of resistance against abuse of power. Mr. Peterson appeared at their door with his golden retriever, who immediately went to Ashley's side, offering the kind of comfort only a dog can provide. "The community Facebook group is exploding," he reported. "People are sharing their own stories of encounters with Barrett. It's like your experience gave them the courage to speak up." The Williams parents arrived next, carrying printed screenshots of social media responses. "The police department's social media is overwhelmed," they explained. "People are demanding action, not just about Barrett, but about the whole system that let this happen." As the morning wore on, the Thompsons' living room became an impromptu command center. David's FBI colleagues had joined the gathering, their presence adding weight to the proceedings. They brought news that the Civil Rights Division was launching a broader investigation into the department's practices. Barrett's suspension had been upgraded to administrative leave pending termination. His union representative had tried to defend his actions, but the video evidence was irrefutable. The bodycam footage, combined with the neighbors' videos and the dashcam evidence, created a comprehensive picture of abuse of power that no amount of explanation could justify. Ashley sat quietly through it all, petting Mr. Peterson's dog and accepting gentle hugs from Mrs. Chen. She was no longer just a teenager who'd been wrongfully arrested. She had become the face of a movement for police accountability in their community. Her father's proud glances told her that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply stand your ground and let the truth speak for itself. By lunchtime, the police department had issued a formal apology and announced a comprehensive review of all officers' conduct records. The chief had scheduled a town hall meeting for the following evening. What had started as one officer's abuse of power was rapidly transforming into an opportunity for real systemic change. And it all began because a young volunteer, 3 blocks from home, had refused to accept injustice without question. 3 months after that rainy evening on Pine Grove Street, the community gathered in the high school auditorium for a special ceremony. The space was packed with familiar faces, Mrs. Chen in the front row, the Williams family a few seats down, and Mr. Peterson with his golden retriever, now a certified therapy dog who visited schools to help children learn about their rights and responsibilities during police encounters. Ashley stood at the podium, her volunteer shirt from the animal shelter replaced with a crisp blazer. The past few months had transformed her from a quiet high school student into a powerful voice for change. "What happened to me that night wasn't unique," she began, her voice steady and clear. "What was unique was that I had a father in the FBI, neighbors who refused to look away, and a community that demanded accountability." The audience listened intently as she described the changes their small incident had sparked. Barrett had been officially terminated, with the police union declining to contest the decision after reviewing the overwhelming evidence. But that was just the beginning. The police department had undergone a complete overhaul. The new Civilian Oversight Committee, on which Mrs. Chen now served, reviewed all use-of-force incidents and complaint patterns. Weekly bodycam reviews had become mandatory, and the department's traffic stop data was publicly available on a new transparency portal. David Thompson, sitting in the front row, watched his daughter with pride. The FBI's Civil Rights Division had expanded their investigation beyond their city, using the incident as a catalyst to examine similar patterns in neighboring departments. What started as one wrongful arrest had snowballed into regional reform. But the real change, Ashley continued, gesturing to the crowd, happened in our community. We learned that standing together makes us stronger. We learned that recording injustice isn't just about capturing evidence, it's about bearing witness and saying this isn't right. The Williams kids, who had watched everything unfold from their driveway that night, now led a youth program teaching other teenagers about their rights during police encounters. Their parents had helped develop a community response network, ensuring that no one had to face difficult situations alone. Chief Richardson stepped up to the podium next. The past months had aged him, but there was new energy in his voice. "We've retrained our entire force," he announced. "Every officer has completed enhanced bias awareness programs, but more importantly, we've changed how we measure success. It's not about the number of arrests or citations anymore, it's about community trust and positive interactions." The changes weren't limited to their city. Police departments across the state had started implementing similar reforms, using their model as a template. The story of what happened on Pine Grove Street had become a case study in police accountability training programs. Mrs. Chen rose to speak next, her small frame belying her strong voice. "I've lived on Pine Grove Street for 40 years, she said. "I've seen many changes, but none as important as this. Now when I see a police car in our neighborhood, I feel protection, not fear." The ceremony continued with the unveiling of new department policies, each one a direct response to what had happened that rainy night. But the real story wasn't in the official changes, it was in the way the community had come together. The animal shelter where Ashley volunteered had started a program bringing therapy animals to community police dialogue sessions. Mr. Peterson's golden retriever was a regular participant, helping break down barriers between officers and residents. Local schools had incorporated lessons about civil rights and community engagement into their curricula. The next generation would grow up understanding both their rights and their role in maintaining a just society. As the ceremony drew to a close, Ashley looked out at the gathered faces, neighbors who had become activists, officers who had become allies, and community members who had found their voice. The incident that could have left her bitter had instead inspired a movement. 3 months ago, I was just a volunteer heading home from the animal shelter, she concluded. Today, we're all volunteers in a bigger cause, making sure our community is safe and just for everyone. What happened that night was wrong, but what happened afterward was right. And that's the story we'll keep telling. The applause that followed wasn't just for Ashley. It was for every person who had refused to look away, every neighbor who had stepped forward, and every official who had chosen accountability over convenience. Pine Grove Street had become more than just an address. It was now a symbol of what could happen when a community stood together against injustice. As people filed out of the auditorium, there was a sense that this wasn't an ending but a beginning. The changes they'd fought for would need to be protected and nurtured. But looking at the faces around her, Mrs. Chen's determined smile, the Williams kids' proud stance, Mr. Peterson's gentle encouragement, Ashley knew their community was ready for the challenge. The sun was setting as they left the auditorium, casting long shadows just like that evening 3 months ago. But now, those shadows didn't bring fear, they'd brought determination. Because sometimes the darkest moments light the way to the brightest changes, and sometimes it takes just one person standing up for what's right to help an entire community find its voice.